speaker this evening is Ken Moelis. He is founder, chairman, and chief executive officer of Moelis & Company, which is a global investment bank. He gives strategic advice to companies, governments, financial sponsors, and others. And he's well known in the city because he has over 30 years of investment banking experience. He was the head of corporate finance with Donaldson, Lufkin, and Ginrette. He was global head of investment banking at UBS, and then president of UBS Investment Bank before he went over to found Moelis & Company. He's also on the board of the University of Pennsylvania. He's on the board of overseers of the Wharton School, which is where he got his MBE. He's on the board of the Tourette's Syndrome Association, board of governors of Cedars-Sinai Hospital. And his topic for us this evening is Check Your Premises, an objectivist's approach to the modern world. Ken.
Thank you. This is the most beautiful place I've ever spoken, so I feel honored to be here, and thank you. And it is a privilege because I think Ayn Rand and the whole objectivist methodology has, as I said, probably affected my life more than I know. It's one of those things where I think having a philosophy and deep-rooted belief leads you to make decisions that you otherwise wouldn't make. And I talk about it because I've now read, just to give you a brief summary, I've read, and I spoke to this to Yaron about this, I've read Atlas Shrugged 4 different times. And interestingly, it's done 4 different things in my life. I read it first when I was 17, maybe 18, and it really confirmed, it's a funny thing, you have these views in life that what people are saying don't match with what you think should happen in life. And it really, I think, saved me at 17 and 18 and confirmed that this was a way you could live your life. I have to admit, I always say this, at 17, 18, I was told you could skip the speech. So, everybody, they say, look, by the time you get to the speech, you could just skip over it. I later found out that's the best part of the book. But I read it again. It was interesting. I went to work. I read it again when I was 25. And at that point, it really confirmed for me a different thing. It confirmed for me I was working extremely hard on Wall Street as an analyst. And you're sort of wondering, is this worth it? And I remember getting through the book and rededicating myself. I know exactly where I was. I know I was sitting in Hawaii and on vacation, and I got through it. And I rededicated myself. I said, I'm going to do this. I'm going to do this the way the heroes in this book did it. And it motivated me for the next 20 years, I think, to really put my head down and focus on achieving quality in my own life of work. Interestingly, again, I read it when I was 47. And I was, again, by the way, this must be my vacation. I live on the West Coast. I was in Hawaii. And I was the president of UBS at the time, and I was really not happy with the bureaucracy and everything going on. And I got to some point in the book, I think it was when Dagny Taggart decided to build her own railroad. And I just closed the book, and I knew I was quitting. And I was going to set out and do something different. And it was, by the way, interestingly, it was at the peak. It was in the middle of some of the best times on Wall Street. And it just goes to show, it was 2006. So by the time I quit and started my business, the crisis had happened, and it was good to have made that decision. And then after giving a speech on how it affected my life, I decided to reread it again last year as an entrepreneur, as somebody who could almost see it from a different point of view. And a whole different experience to read it from the point of view of the entrepreneur. So I just want to say, in each phase of your life, for those of you who haven't picked it up in a while, it will do things for you at a different stage of your life, and it'll cause you to think of things. And by the way, the last time I read it, I decided I was going to dog ear each page that I thought was worth sharing with my children or my wife or my employees. The trouble was the whole book was dog-eared. I didn't know where to start. Every page was just genius, and I'm sure I missed some. But I decided, and it was at an auction in the Ayn Rand Institute, I happened to buy a book. I think it was, I forgot which it was, a first edition I bought at the auction. And I bought it because on the first page was written in small print, check your premises, Ayn Rand. And I really did think about everything I've learned from this philosophy and from Rand. And I think the most valuable one is check your premises. Check where you're starting. Check your foundation, because the conclusions are all a result of how you built your foundation of thought. And I tell that to our employees. They ask me how you build a culture in a firm, and I've always said, you got to start with consistent premises, or else all this arguing about the ultimate decision is just noise. The real thing is, what's your premise? What's your focus? And who you're serving? What did you build the business to be? And I think I try to explain this to people. And if you're ever in an argument with somebody about anything, ask them what their premise is, and you'll just see people lose it. They won't have put a premise in place. And I think I have a big T-shirt, and I keep it at home. It's a Randyism that A is A. And 1 + 1 actually does equal 2. And if you don't forget that, if you don't live your life hoping that 1 + 1 might equal another number, it'll force you to make some decisions. It has forced me to make some decisions along the way. So I thought I would go through some of those and what I'm seeing in the world and how the premises that I use to determine it might help in understanding what I think is going on. Based more economically, I realize we could speak, given what went on in Paris, we could speak about a lot of things. But I figure my best addition to the worldview might be what I think is going on in the economy and the world and what I've learned. So first of all, check your premises. So what do I tell people when I speak and when I talk to my own people? I say there's two things people get wrong that leads to more bad decisions that I've seen in my 35 years on Wall Street, and they're deadly mistakes. And one is confusing correlation with causation. All over the place, you will have people confuse correlation with causation. I tried to imbue this on my kids when they were young, and I used to say to them, if you jog, if you run, you will live longer, correct. The correlation is people who jog are healthier and live longer. I said, but what if the only people who can jog are healthy? I said, maybe there is no correlation, the causation of the correlation. Maybe you have to look backwards and check your premise as to which is the subset and which is the causation. Do joggers get healthy, or do mostly healthy people jog? And I say, when you ask these questions to people and you say, start and reverse the question and make sure the conclusion you came to isn't hidden in your answer. And I think on Wall Street, by the way, we saw a tremendous amount of that. You will see people following false correlation and attributing causation to it, and then taking enormous bets on that. And I say the other one that I think has caused more problems in the world of finance and economics is survivorship bias. The falseness that the interesting part that the person who shows up your door as a genius with a track record might just be a random event. As you said, the only people who come knock on your door and ask you to invest money with them are the people who ended up with a good track record. That doesn't say anything about what will happen tomorrow. And there is a lot of survivorship bias in the world. As I think one author once said, it would actually, people say, well, how about Warren Buffett? And I think one thing I live by is, it would actually be an extraordinary event in the world of finance if there wasn't a Warren Buffett. Meaning, in a bell curve, there's always going to be somebody on the right. And then you have to ask yourself, does that tell you anything about the next decision? And whether or not that's going to be right. So I like to say, these are really important things as you go about setting about, I think, building a business, making investment decisions, and doing things. One of the great stories, by the way, I tell this because still people don't, on this survivorship bias. There was a story, I think it was Nissim Taleb who wrote it in his book. I don't know if you've ever read Fooled by Randomness, but he talks about playing a Russian roulette game. I would steal it from him, but I think I should attribute to him. And he said, okay, if I came to 5 of you and said, let's play Russian roulette. 1 bullet, 6 chambers. The winner, anybody who survives gets $100 million. Now, the right answer to that is don't play the game. But let's say I convince 6 in this room to play. At the end of the game, there'd be 5 centimillionaires and 1 dead person. Nobody would ever remember the dead person. But the 5 centimillionaires would soon donate $10 or $20 million to their university, be put on the board of trustees, and be lauded as very, very smart people. Geniuses. And in fact, when they interview their 3rd grade teacher, that teacher will say, you know, I always thought he had a special something. I knew he would be there. And the whole world will develop a mythology around the 5 idiots who chose to play Russian roulette. And never forget that, because sometimes you will run into, many times, you will run into the winner of a Russian roulette game who has portrayed himself as a genius. So how do you get around this in life? And I think one of the interesting things I've done, and I'll try to do this kind of quickly, is watch what people do, not what they say. It's funny, there's some business channels out there, and I have to say, I'm asked to go on the business channel and talk about my company. And you know, it's amazing. You'll never hear me talk about the deep, dark, negative thing that I worried about the night before at 3 in the morning. It will usually be about some great thing my company did. Mostly we do great things, but people will say a lot of things and color what they're thinking about the world and where it's going. Politicians do it. Business people do it. I'm not saying they lie. They just tend to remember and talk about the good things. So I say watch what they do. Just turn the sound off. Watch what people do, not what they're telling you they're doing. And so I'm in the M&A business. And I think people ask me today, what do you think about the world? So I say, you know, and is M&A going to go on? What do you think is driving the forces going on? And are we deep? They usually run in 7-year cycles. So once again, in a Randian way, a lot of the city and Wall Street thinks M&A just has a 7-year cycle, as if some mystical pagan ritual leads to a 7-year cycle. And there's a lot of people who believe it. Oh, we're late in the cycle. We're early in the cycle. In America, we have baseball. What inning are we in? If I get asked what inning we're in one more time, I'll throttle the person. But so I look back, and I'd like to say where I think we are today, but I'll put it in perspective as how I think, if you check your premises, you'd look at the world. So I started in 1980. I'm going to do this fairly quickly, but I think you might find it a little interesting. And that's when M&A really hit, I think, the world of finance. It was not a specialty until the 80s. And there was a huge wave in the 1980s. Started about 1983 to about 1990. And that wave, when you look back on it, was about something unique, undervalued assets. You know, when I joined, I think the Dow Jones Industrial Average was 770, maybe 800, something like that. It's 17,000 today. And there were truly undervalued assets. I mean, there were things, we'll never see another one, it'd be like a unicorn today, but overvalued pension funds. Pension funds that have way more assets in it than the liabilities, and you could reverse them out. LIFO inventories, commodities in the ground that were trading at cents on the dollar. In fact, I think the period was highlighted best by, there was a raider named Boone Pickens, if you're old enough to remember it. He started to go after major oil companies, and his best line was, why drill for oil in Texas when you could drill on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange for half the price? And so he was buying reserves in the ground, proven at way less, cents on the dollar, or what it would cost to drill. So anyway, it was a very hostile period. Hostile takeovers in the 80s, if you remember that. Why? People were trying to buy $1 for 50 cents, and the only way to do it was hostile. Anyway, that was that cycle, and it does tell you something about the time. It ended in 1990, 1991, really came to a screeching halt on the Iraq invasion, first Iraq invasion of Kuwait. And whether the S&L crisis in the United States, which was an early financial crisis, was a cause, that's really when it stops. And half of Wall Street gets blown up. My firm goes out of business overnight, Drexel Burnham. And the whole thing sits for a while and repairs itself, a little like we did in the last few years. 1993-94, the next cycle starts. What is the 94 cycle about? All about growth. Growth at any cost. It's the beginning, I mean, when you look back, it's the beginning of the NASDAQ going to 5,000. It's the beginning of the tech run-up. And the holy grail was growth. People wanted to buy growth. In fact, I counted for the speech, and Cisco, 68 M&A transactions, 68 purchases of companies between 1995 and 2000. So growth at almost any price, put it together. I even make the joke, I said, General Electric bought NBC. Okay, so if I told you today that there was a headline that General Electric just bought CBS, you'd think it was funny today. But in that era, growth at any price, everybody goes, wow, that's a great idea. Let's make some wind turbines, some engines, and programming for NBC. I mean, I don't understand, but at the time, growth at any price. And it was interesting, The end of that era actually comes within 6 weeks of the premier no synergy deal, which was AOL Time Warner, which was growth at any price. We'll sell to them, they'll sell to us. Nobody knew what they were going to sell to each other, but they merge. 6 weeks later, the NASDAQ cracks, whether because of it or not. And it's interesting, right at that time, by the way, I'll just give you a flavor in life so you check what you see going on. If you take the NASDAQ to the utilities in the United States, regulated cash flow, high quality, by far the biggest spread ever. So safe, stable cash flow, growth, valued as far apart as they've ever been 6 weeks before the end of it. And the market collapses at that point. So that's about 2000. Market collapses, a bunch of things. I think the NASDAQ crash, 9/11. You could point to a lot of things. I think, fake growth, by the way, if we see this in this market. Remember, we had WorldCom, Ayn Rand, Tyco, some significant companies who, in order to show the growth necessary to maintain their valuations, did things around the edges that were not, in reality. So you could see how important it was to show growth. It was important enough that some of the executives actually were accused of misleading the books. So as usual, we go and repair everybody's balance sheet. The next M&A wave, which will tell you a little bit about the world at the time, 2003, and it's based almost 100% on cheap credit. We go through a wave from 03 to 07, if you remember the environment, where credit was being given away. I think it had something to do, by the way, I know there's a lot of city people here, but the consolidation, all of a sudden the investment banks were merged into the commercial banks. And I think both sides thought they had a new toy, but they didn't quite know what to do with it. So the commercial banks' idea, let's buy the investment banks. They have really good contacts at the CEO level. And the investment banks were, hey, let's get those balance sheets. We can lend a lot of money, do a lot of transactions, and we can give our money away. So you put it together, and you have a combustible system. And by the way, from 03 to 07, we go into this period, people don't realize this. Private equity was much smaller than it is today. The largest private equity fund was probably $2 or $3 billion. We come out of that period with $20 billion funds. We come out with private equity buys almost everything with cheap credit. My last 4 deals before I changed, as I was starting this firm, were the sale of Hilton Hotels for $28 billion, Harrah's Casinos for like 25, Univision Broadcasting for 17, and Sallie Mae, all of which went to private equity, all of which had, Hilton finally did work, but all of which had a very tough time of it. But it was based on cheap credit. When I say cheap, it wasn't just interest rates low, no covenants, multiples of leverage that are unsustainable. And look, this was a short, sharp cycle. 03 to 07, over. And I said, why was it so short? I said, look, we gave matches to professionals this time. This wasn't just, this was, the private equity guys, these are professional pyromaniacs, and they got the matches of cheap credit, and they were going to use it, and they did. They used it aggressively. They were, everything. By the way, it wasn't just corporates. This was what was going on in mortgages as well. So look, that blows up in the crisis, and I think everybody remembers, that's pretty, I think you can all remember that. So where are we today? Okay, I think that's an interesting question. Where are we today? And I believe what the M&A market is telling you right now is we are in a deflationary period. What's going on, what people are doing, when I say, the reason I'm talking about M&A is because I say, watch what they do. M&A is a big move. It's illiquid. You can buy a stock. Watch what I can buy a stock tomorrow and tell you I'm a fan of, IBM. And if, I could sell it 2 days later. It is not a captured moment. M&A is an illiquid, long-term decision that you make that you have a very difficult time reversing. So you think long and hard about it. I don't care what you say on TV. When you do an M&A deal, you're kind of stuck with it for 10 years and or more. So why are we seeing these gigantic mergers today? It's because people have to take their costs out. Because for the last 4 years, people like the Federal Reserve in the United States have started out the year projecting 4% growth rate. By the end of the first quarter, they say maybe it'll be 3. By the end of the second quarter, they say it looks like 2. And by the end of the third, they say 4, but 1, but next year we'll do 4. We're reaching escape velocity. And for 4 years in a row, we've not had 4% growth. It's happening It's happening right now while we speak. I mean, growth rates are slowing dramatically. I think growth rates in emerging markets and around even developed world is slow. So I think we have a set of corporations that know they cannot make the top line. I think most CEOs go home and they see whatever anybody's projecting for them and they say, I can't do that. So what's next? You have to take costs out. So interestingly, when you're in a growth environment, a firm like Cisco can do small acquisitions and it adds to the revenue lines and it's growth. You can add to your revenue line, but you could add growth. You can buy a small company that adds to your revenue. In costs, the only way to take costs out are to do these very large mergers because costs are only a percentage of your income statement. And that's why you're seeing, if you notice, we're seeing a lot of number one companies merge with number twos, very large companies coming together for cost synergies. And my feeling on this, it's the economy and it's also some other thing that I think is happening and we're not talking about enough, and that is that we're in a massive technology deflationary period. And it's, you can see it. If you're paying attention to it, you can see it all the time. When I say, people go, well, what do you mean deflation? And I said, well, how many of you spent $500 or $600, the equivalent, on an iPhone 5? Well, I said, what deflation means, if you would have, now that you spent your $500 or $600 on an iPhone 5, a year later, year and a half later, it's worth zero. It's worth zero. If you kept your $500 or $600 and put it in a bank earning zero, you'd now have an iPhone 6S, which is actually worth something today. But that is the definition of deflation. It's that the purchasing power of your money is actually gaining value. And if you spend it and don't save it, the value of what you can purchase is improving at a rapid pace. Things are getting better, cheaper, quicker, and the assets in your portfolio are actually depreciating much faster than we're admitting to each other. I did my first deal when I was on Wall Street very early in the 80s was to do what we in Manhattan are the yellow taxi licenses. They're called medallions. So you own a medallion, it's a right to drive a cab in New York City, and it was gold. It was gold because they limited it, and New York City was New York City. So of course it would a great inflation hedge. And so I think when I started, don't hold me to this, but I think it was like $100,000 for a medallion. It was almost as straight a line as you can think up to about $1.3 million about 3 years ago. Then came Uber. And I don't know what I'm not sure there's been a lot of sales, but I think they're down, somewhat down 30-40% if there are a lot of sales. And this was a store of value, attacked by a new technology that's changing the underlying value of an asset so rapidly and out of the blue. What Airbnb is doing to hotels, what Amazon does to every retailer every day, driving the profit margin to zero, the pricing power. The internet is taking the pricing power away from the producer. There used to be a tremendous asymmetry of information. You'd walk into your local electronics retailer, and they would tell you what the best TV is. And as we know now, you just kind of hold up your phone and you say, no, you're wrong. I can order this right now for $27 less. And it's going on in every part of the world. In fact, I like to say, even on the commodities of the world, people say, well, you have commodity oil's driving deflation. It's interesting. We didn't find a new oil field. There was no new oil field. It was technology. There was a new technology called fracking that just increased the amount of oil that you could recover. So what I think is happening in the world today, and I'm not sure people even realize how quickly they're coming under attack. And it could be, by the way, it's technology, but I also want to say it's active government regulation as well. So the government is also hanging out there ready to come into your business like Obamacare in the United States and overnight change the value of everything you invested in. So it's a very scary time, I think, for revenue and assets. In fact, I was saying the other day, generally accepted accounting principles, they've been around kind of standards. They change, but it's interesting. The depreciation schedules, go to the back of a 10K or an annual report, and they usually have a set of assets that are depreciated, and your choices are kind of 7, 10, 15 years. Well, I said to somebody, I don't think any asset lasts 10 years anymore. I mean, maybe real estate, but as I said, if you bought a bunch of iPhone 5s and you put it on a 5-year depreciation, well, your books are wrong. They're worthless. they're unsellable, or they're depreciating much more rapidly. The servers you bought, the plant you built, what's it worth? And I actually think one of the things that might be looked at as you look through is are the cash flows being generated accurate or not, because the depreciation of the underlying property is so much faster. And so I think this is going through business throughout the world, is what do we do about this? How do we take costs out? How do we maintain our pricing power? So you see that, let's say, in the media, where you see big content mergers because you have the big cable TV mergers. Why? They want to negotiate with the content providers from strength. And then the content providers want to put together enough content to hit back at the cable providers with strength. And so you have huge consolidations of people, and then all of a sudden you have over the top, where it goes around everybody and delivers to the younger generation who's cutting the cord and buying a la carte on over the top, willing to watch a show through Hulu, a day later for free. So this is a rapid fire devaluation. By the way, if a lot of you in different industries, if you think about your own industry, I think you'll think of a way your industry is being attacked and having trouble maintaining price. And so what you're seeing is these mergers to take out costs. Now, the interesting part I want to say, because people ask me, is that terrible for the world? I think it's the greatest thing for the winner in this is the consumer. This whole idea of income inequality. I went to Davos last year, and it was like my first time, by the way, and it was like a hammer, a group of people. I call it a hammer looking for a nail to hit. And all the conversation was, I went to a dinner with some of the smartest people in the world, and how's the world? Every single person went around the room and said, this income inequality, it's terrible, we got to do something about it. And after everybody agreed, the head of one of the newspapers said, does anybody else have a point of view? And I said, I'd like to speak. I said, it's the greatest time for the middle class there's ever been. Healthcare, people are living 7 years longer. How do you value that? People are walking around with a supercomputer in their pocket. Almost half, the whole world has a supercomputer in their pocket. So where in the old days, if you wanted to make an airline reservation, only the wealthiest would call up their secretary or their personal assistant and say, what's the train schedule? What's this? How do I make a dinner reservation? The whole world has access to infinite amounts of information, and they get to use it. In fact, the worker who used to have to miss, their favorite Manchester United game can now watch it on their iPhone on the way back and forth to work. I even said it this. My grandfather, I remember he came home from a rag factory, and I think, his biggest worry was counting his fingers to make sure some machine didn't get him. I think some of the biggest problems I see in marriages in the United States today is whether they should commit to Homeland or Game of Thrones. And why are you ahead of me? And you said you wouldn't watch it without me. And I'm a fan of this show. And by the way, it's world class. This type of entertainment being delivered to your home, to everybody, pretty much for free. Look at a movie from 20 years ago and compare it to what you're watching on your TV. Well, by the way, the reason there are no good movies in the theaters anymore is because this TV fare is better. And it's being delivered to everybody in unlimited quantities, and people are racing to give it to you. So there are things like that I say show you why it really isn't, I don't know. There's only one set of people in the world who seem to be terrified about deflation, and that is the central bankers. And it makes no sense other than it causes them to, somewhat, they have this Keynesian view of the world, which, as I said, is the last bastion of socialism in the world. It's an interesting fact. When you really study, Keynesian economics, it really just is a subterfuge socialism inside of a capitalism, that the government can control cycles, the government can, under central banking control cycles, under interest rates. And so the loss of control and the desperate desire not to have deflation, I don't understand. If you did a poll in the world and you said, let me ask a question to consumers. Would you like to buy goods cheaper? Better quality goods cheaper? I think most people would say, yeah, I'm up for that. I can vote for that. And by the way, it's interesting you see that in retail now. The whole new, there used to be, 4 seasons of retail. Now there's every 2 weeks. The Uniqlos and the Zaras are delivering quality items quicker, faster, and they're just killing the slower moving place. So I think the winner in this is the consumer. And I think that I say that just because I don't want you to think I'm talking about deflation as a negative. I think it's a huge positive. I think it's a force for tremendous good in the world. And you just got to prepare for it. I believe some of the volatility we're seeing in stock markets around the world is we have a generation, and I'm now beginning to be the oldest guy in the room. I'm 57, but my whole generation, that's a lot of now running companies. What did we learn for 30 years? We were taught, lock in your financing. Be careful. Inflation's coming. The mantra at everybody my age, it was, hey, we got to lock in rates. We got to do everything to watch out because any day now there's going to be inflation. By the way, since the crisis, we've been told inflation's going to spike any day, all this money printing. And it's now, as I said, I owned 10-year bonds back in 2008, 2007. And I remember my broker calling me up. He goes, look, rates are going to go up. You got to sell those and go short. Well, now my 10-year bond is a 1-year bond, but at least I got the interest rate because it's been almost 8 years of low interest rates. I think we will have low interest rates longer than people think. There is no reason. People want their money back. I think the idea of putting your money in high-quality investments where you maintain your buying power and you get your money back is going to become more in vogue as people realize that there is a true threat to the underlying value of your assets from regulatory and technology that is underestimated and can cause, I think, significant loss in a short period of time as per the taxi license. So I do think going forward you are going to see, you're seeing this in the market. For those of you close, right now you're seeing low quality cash flows like high yield bonds, junk bonds are devaluing. High quality cash flows are trading very well. People want their money back. Swiss bonds, 10-year Swiss bond, pretty much a zero return. I haven't looked at it in a while, but it's close to a zero kind of real interest rate. Why? People trust that the Swiss system will return your buying power to you in 10 years. And they're willing to make that trade. They're just, I want my buying power with certainty 10 years from now. I think it's a good trade. Because I said even in medicine, if you get your money back in 10 years, I suspect that we won't have barbaric things like chemotherapy. We will actually have immunotherapy and other, you will actually, if you maintain your buying power and you're able to afford it, there will be health cures that will boggle our minds based on what's going on. You'll be buying the iPhone 13s, or I don't know if I've done the math, maybe it's the 17s by then, which will probably do all sorts of things for you I can't even imagine. But maintaining your buying power is going to be a very important thing. Now, one other trend I'd like to see, I said check your premises and you'll see what's going on around the world. I think it's interesting. I spent a lot of time traveling. I was in China and Macau, watching what's going on as a result of the crackdown. I was in Brazil earlier in the year, and I was in India right before that. And it was interesting to me. So what's going on in politics around the world? India put an election of Modi. One of the main reasons, I think, was corruption crackdown. India, about a year and a half ago, said, we want to kind of rein in corruption. Xi Jinping definitely said, has, but somewhere between 100 or 200,000 people supposedly in jail trying to crack down on corruption. Brazil, huge corruption crackdown on that might lead, to high levels of the government. And interestingly, by the way, I said, I don't think it's random that you have FIFA finally undergo a corruption crackdown. So why do you think this is happening? And I will tell you why. In a world in which every cost, in order to maintain your business, every cost has to be wrung out of the system. I believe corruption is a cost that can't survive in these systems. I think you can't, when you had 10 or 15% inflation, 10% inflation in Brazil, 15%, if a company put a 10% bribe to build a plant, over the next 5 or 6 years, the inflation would obliterate the percentage of the bribe as a relation to the underlying asset. If there's no inflation, that line item will render you uncompetitive. And I think, I'm not, that's why I don't think what's going on in the world is random. I think people are saying, China is saying as a whole, if we don't stamp out the line item called corruption that's running through our industry, we will not be competitive, and we will have a problem. Now, I'm not saying they all got together and went through my analysis on deflation, but I think watch what people do and then try to string it together and figure out what's the premise driving them, and I think this is. And I think this is why in a deflationary world, every cost gets rung out. By the way, it will explain, in the US, we have a tremendous amount of things called inversions going on, where our companies are trying to invert into lower tax shells. Well, why today? You could have inverted 10 years ago, and I'll tell you why. After you've gotten done taking every item out of your cost of goods sold, there's only 3 items on the balance sheet you can reduce on the income statement where you can reduce cost. Cost of goods sold, believe me, they've tried everything. They're doing everything they can to reduce cost of goods sold. You can merge companies together and take your SG&A out by firing the bureaucracy and the overhead. But when you're all done, there's one last big expense item that you can't ignore, and that's tax rate. And I think in a world where there's no growth and a high emphasis on cost, the last cost everybody's has to look at is tax rates. And you see people all of a sudden, and I say it's all of a sudden because of what the focus is, looking at inversions in a new way. So look, I think I do think that some of the positives of, the last thing I'll say is, the other part about the measurements of GDP is, I also think somebody's going to have to throw the whole measurement system out one day. I don't know how. I'm not that smart. I'll leave it to Yaron to figure it out. But so much of our economy and our satisfaction is now not registering. I was lucky enough before coming here, I was able to take a trip, and I was thinking about this speech and with my wife. So we were in some little village in Pulien, she said, "Oh, could you take a picture of us?" Or she asked me to take a picture of her golf. She goes, "You can hold the button down here and it'll do burst pictures." I'm not a big technologist, this was new to me. So I could take 25 pictures of her in a row until she looked good enough that she would post it. Which is, maybe it took 125. She's not here, so I should be nice. But in my mind, every one was beautiful, just for the ride, just in case she... Hi, honey. So, but I was thinking about that. 10 years ago, that was a $20 transaction. That involved film, development, there was a whole GDP involved with that. It's zero, and yet the satisfaction of what comes out of it is 100-fold more fun and interesting and flexible. Think of how much better it is, and yet GDP is registering zero for the entire transaction. And I think we're seeing that in a lot of areas where the quality of our lives are improving, and yet the measurement of GDP, which was based mostly on material, is going to go down dramatically. I think as our kids share cars, the sharing economy, I don't know about what's going on here, but in Los Angeles, it's one of the greatest things I've ever seen, by the way. Uber. We did not have a great taxi system. Kids would go out, and I had 3 boys in their teens. And you'd wonder how they're going to have fun and get home alive. Today, everyone leaves their car home. Every one of these kids leaves their car home and Ubers home. And I think I've seen a stat on this. I don't have it exactly, but teenage and low 20-year-old male deaths is declining fairly rapidly as a drunk driving deaths. So what is the value of that? What is the value that technology is bringing to a family that has their children and in another world where you didn't have such a system does not? So I don't know how we're going to measure all the improvements, but this idea, and I think it's important, because this idea that income inequality is a tremendous negative to the world is sweeping some of the elitist opinion leaders. And what we should be looking at is life quality, which is improving so dramatically that I'm not sure. I asked this question, I'll ask you. When I have an argument about this with my friends, I said, called 1983, I was 25 years old. I said, do you think the average 25-year-old would rather be the richest person in the world in 1983 or an average wage earner today, quality of life? And now, I do say one thing for the male constituency in the audience. I say, you have to hold constant your attraction to the opposite sex versus being the richest man in the world. I know that's politically incorrect, but I had a couple of friends go, look, I want to be the richest person in the world. It is a great way to meet women. So I said, you have to hold that constant. And then in a generation, I actually believe that if you've had full knowledge of what it's like, most people would choose to be an average, to live the life of an average wage earner. I don't think they realized there was no, there weren't 500 channels. There wasn't, if you got several forms of cancer, you died. There were no cell phones. The availability of music 24/7, which is so much a part of the world today, was not available. I just don't think people understand how much in one generation we have taken a life and moved it and how much quality we've put in that life. And by the way, if we keep going like this, it'll only get better if we don't allow the regulatory environment to hold it back. So look, that's. I think I'm going to open it up for some questions, and I could go on with this. But my feeling is, if you're watching the world today, people at the end of these things. I'm not a stockbroker. People always go, "What stock would you?" When I go to some things, and I said, if I was thinking of one thing, it would be to upgrade the quality of what you're involved in as a portfolio. I do think if you're not investing in your assets, if you're not putting money back into the quality of what you're doing, your asset base will deteriorate. Moelis and Company has no leverage. I grew up in a world where everybody was levered, and I was big in leverage finance. We have no leverage. I believe interest rates are actually, on a real basis, much higher than they feel. Everybody says, oh, we got to lock in, it's just such cheap financing. I don't believe that. I believe when you take into account the depreciation of the underlying assets that you're financing, that actual interest rates are not low. And so I would encourage people to make sure you keep an eye, de-lever to an extent if you're running a company than you think, and upgrade the quality of the cash flow that you're investing in, because they are subject to, they have to be able to respond to the market environment. I think with that, I'd love to, I hope I didn't talk too long there, but I'd love to take any questions and make it a conversation.